Hey, what is up guys? Welcome back to another video, and in this video we are going to be continuing on with our C# tutorial series, and in this tutorial we're going to be taking a look at for loops in C#. So what are for loops? Well, for loops essentially allow you to specify a specific number of times you want to loop through something. They're sometimes called counter loops. Where you give it a value that acts as a counter for how many times it's looping, and if it meets it, and if it reaches a specific condition, then it stops. There are three stages to a for loop. There is the initialization of the counter variable. In most cases, it's going to be I, J, or K, or whatever, some kind of singular letter most of the time. Then there's the test for the counter. So if this condition is met, it keeps going. The loop keeps going. If it's not met, the loop ends. Okay? And then there is the increment stage, where we increment the counter. Now you might say, oh, so with the for loop it's impossible to create an infinite loop? No. That's just not the case. You can still create an infinite loop with the for loop. It's just not, generally speaking, it's a little bit easier to avoid. But it is still possible, and it's very easy to do, just like with the while loop. I'll talk about in this video exactly what I mean by it's a little bit easier to avoid, but still easy to do at the same time. All right, so let's get started with actually looking at the syntax for the for loop. I gave you the three components of a for loop, so now let's actually see what it looks like in practice. So for a for loop, you need to use the for keyword, FOR. And then there are opening and closing parentheses with opening and closing curly brackets. Okay? So in these parentheses, we are going to do those three stages of the for loop. First, the initialization. Int I, for most cases, you'll find I as the counter variable name, equals, and then we give it an initial value. In this case, we're going to say 0, semicolon, and then we do our test. So if I is less than 100, let's say. So if this condition is met, it'll keep going. As long as I is less than 100, it'll keep going. And again, a semicolon after that statement. And then we can do the increment. So let's say I++. And that is our for loop. So what this is telling us is it's essentially loop through, go ahead and do a loop 100 times, and when the counter is 100 or greater, specifically if it's 100, end the loop. So by the time the counter reaches 99, it'll have 100 iterations under its belt. And we can see this by saying console write line I plus 1. Because remember, I is initialized to 0. So if we plus 1, we can get how many iterations this loop has actually done. So go ahead and do your Control F5. And you can see we've gone from 1 all the way down to 100. So it did 100 iterations. And that works, but what if you want to do something like we did with the while loop, where we can instead of having I++, we can have I plus equals, let's say, 10. Right? And so what this will then do is it will go through and add 10 to the counter each time the loop iterates. So from 0, it'll say 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. However, here's the thing, right? By the time it's 100, 100 is not less than 100. So it'll only go, it'll go up to 90, and then once it says, oh, it's 90, we'll loop through, and then by the time it comes back around, it'll be 100, so it won't loop again. Yeah? So to demonstrate that, we can say console write line I. Okay? And go ahead and run your code. And you can see it only went up to 90. Alright, so with that being said, what did I mean by it's still possible and pretty easy to create an infinite loop with a for loop, but it's also a little bit harder, a little bit easier rather to avoid? Well, if you look in the 3 statements inside of our for loop there, inside of the parentheses, you can see that we have the state, we have the increment / decrement and the test right next to each other. So generally speaking, you're not going to get confused as to what direction the counter is going in relation to the condition. So it's a little bit easier to not screw it up, but it is still possible. All right, so let's go ahead and go into our editor. And we can go ahead and do a, say, for int j equals 0. J is less than 100. I minus minus. Or the j minus minus, I guess. And so what this will do is this will create an infinite loop, because here we are creating an integer j, which is our counter, initializing it to 0, and then we're testing if j is less than 100, but for our increment decrement sort of statement, we're constantly bringing it down instead of up. So this loop will never end. I will always be less than 100. And that's what I mean by it's still easy to screw it up. It's still easy to create an infinite loop. So my recommendation is to just try to avoid that. I'm going to comment this code out. Don't execute this. I'm also going to put a label on it here saying, do not execute. And so if you execute this, it'll go on forever and ever and ever until you stop it. And depending on how good your computer is, it might lock it up. So be careful. Okay. I'm only including this to show you guys, hey, this is something you shouldn't do. Alright. So thank you guys so very much for watching. This has been For Loops in C#. Thank you all so very much for watching. See you later.